I am pleased to be able to welcome back to the bookstore Alexandra Fuller to talk about her latest memoir, Travel Light, Move Fast. A continuation of sorts of the family history memoirs that began with the critically acclaimed Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, chronicling her upbringing on a farm in war-torn Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Whereas other works have spotlighted her childhood, her mother, and the effects of war, this latest piece brings into focus the incomparable and fast-moving life of her father, Tim Fuller. Beginning with his death a few years ago, the memoir is framed along the advice that Tim gives over the course of his life, from his black sheep exile from England to starting a family and growing bananas through many southern African nations in the midst of colonial revolutions. Moving through the grief and the aftermath of her father's life, these lessons come to embody the resilience that is often necessary in this world. With striking, beautiful prose and her signature talent for effortlessly blending timelines across the decades, this book is, quote, a celebration of the man whose profound influence helped shape her own worldview. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra Fuller to Politics and Prose.
I love this bookstore. Thank you for existing, Politics and Prose. The life of the mind and the space to safely... if you've heard me talk before, go to sleep for the next couple of minutes, because I say this every time, and every time with more and more urgency. We have to remember what freedom of speech is, what it costs, and how to do it. And that doesn't mean getting the most likes, and it doesn't mean not offending people, but it does mean in I think the most profound way, understanding that the opposite and equal reaction to freedom of speech is having the courage and dignity to listen to one another and to, assume that the other person is using the dignity of their intelligence and speaking from there. And so having a responsible speech and a responsible listening and dignity and decorum, we are so losing decency in our conversation, and we're so losing the ability to disagree well, on which our freedom is actually based. And I know this because I came from first Rhodesia, where they had censorship since 1964. And then Robert Mugabe, not a fan of freedom of speech. Most of the countries I lived in, there was a dictator in Malawi. He really wasn't a fan either. And so there has been this way in which I could not really imagine what it would be like. The States really invented freedom of speech. It was like, that is what you're known for. That and Michael Jackson. Like, if you're Zambian, those are the two things you knew. And we were socialist, and we were really kind of cut off. So we really assumed that in the States, this is what we were taught. Some of the streets were paved with gold and everyone else was heroin addicts. And this was confirmed for me when I met my American river guide husband, who came out to Zambia to raft the Zambezi River. And you know how we give each other shorthand, but your shorthand doesn't translate, by the way. So you can tell people by shorthand, like where you went to school, and then expect someone to be impressed. But if they're from Zambia, they don't care if you went to Harvard. That doesn't mean anything unless they've seen Legally Blonde. And so when my husband told me that he was mainline Philadelphia, I was like, oh, one of the original heroin addicts. This is going to go well. It's good. With my alcoholic family, like, surely there's more dysfunction. Then you're just not a heroin addict for free. It's usually because you're, insane or racist or both. And so I thought, well, this is going to work out. And so then we got married and we moved to the States, and I had freedom of speech, and I was so excited. And I hobbled back from every dinner party because I'd been, kicked in the shins by my, now not surprisingly, ex-husband. Because he'd be like, just because you've got freedom of speech doesn't mean you need to exercise it the entire time. Like, those of us who've had it for a few generations are a bit more tasteful with it. He's like, you're more like the nouveau riche of freedom of speech. In 2000, when I became a US citizen, due to some unfortunate election results that coincided with my belief that had been sort of seared into me by South African politics that was one man, one vote. I didn't understand the corrupt American electoral system. So I thought, well, if I become a US citizen and live in Wyoming, I'm a game changer, which, obviously I'm not. But I believed that briefly enough to become a US citizen. And I am outspoken about my country that I've moved to. And I didn't want to get thrown out. So you have to sort of belong here. And so I went through the whole rigmarole, and I just want to say that if you're of Scottish, Irish, English descent, let's say, and you go to have your interview and you get to the question where it says, is there a history of family insanity? Like, if you were born here and you're of Scottish, Irish, English descent, you're lucky that question doesn't happen as you're a fetus. Because if you come here as an adult, you might have to lie. And then I got sworn in at Kemmerer, which used to be the capital of Wyoming, and it was it was me and a whole bunch of people from El Salvador, Mexico, Guatemala, and the poshest person, the most elevated person they could find to do the swearing-in ceremony was the dentist from next door. So they yank him and he gave the most moving speech. We were all sobbing because it is something to give up your motherland. Like, I think it is, deep in our exceptionalism as humans. I mean, people talk about American exceptionalism, that Americans believe they're exceptionally great. That's actually true of all people everywhere. We as Zimbabweans think God made the country for us and then made us special to live there. Like, that is sort of how it goes. So there's a kind of heartbreak to admit, no, I need to move here. And so what the dentist said, and this was very true, is you're coming here, every immigrant comes with a hunger. Whether it's a hunger to, make a living, or a hunger to have freedom to, to worship as they like, and for me it was freedom of speech. But this is the thing, that if I give this up, I give up me. That cannot and shouldn't be taken away, but I notice it being eroded and self-eroded. Most Americans take the fifth in a way. I mean, most Americans have gotten to the point where we self-censor, and that is sort of the ultimate endpoint of censorship, when you become afraid of speaking out because you're afraid of the consequences online. You're afraid of how you're being tracked. But if we all speak out, and we speak out, responsibly, we can't be stopped. And so I am so grateful for this bookstore, for managing to keep the doors open through thick and thin, and for allowing that this space sit here. And I'm grateful for you, for sitting here and listening to me speak. Okay, those of you who've heard me speak again can wake up. I write because I didn't have a choice, because my mother was very glamorous, East African, raised in Kenya, and she sort of under the shadow of Isaac Dinesen and Elspeth Huxley and whatever. And I actually thought, I'm just as biography worthy as these other bloody women. And the only thing she hadn't done was fly an airplane, so she added that to her list. She found someone in Lusaka who claimed to be a flight instructor. It turns out he wasn't. But she did actually manage to fly solo with the flight instructor in a little tin hut on a friend's airstrip, screaming, "Come back, come back, come back," and my mother singing "Fly Me to the Moon." And she she was too lazy to write her own biography, but understandably it's a lot of work. So she thought, well, I'll just skip it and get one of my children to do it. So when she was pregnant with my older sister, she read her the entire works of Shakespeare in the womb, in the hopes that Vanessa would just be born a literary genius. And she wasn't. She was very bored by it. She can't even really get Vanessa is willfully illiterate. I mean, she won't. Vocabulary is even a bit of an effort for her. So she has astonished a few people by mixing up hitchhiker and hijacker. And when my dad was 69, he said, "Right, that's it. I'm gonna kick the bucket. I'm not gonna bat some other chap's innings. That's not cricket. I've done my 70 years, so I'm gonna snuff it." And very soon. We were very sad about this. And he said, I'm pretty flammable by now. You should just be able to throw a match in my direction. I imagine I'll explode immediately. And he took us all out to the baobab tree where he wanted his ashes scattered, and we were all moved and a bit sort of startled by this. It's not that we're not a maudlin family. It's usually we're drunk when we're maudlin, and this was all happening quite sober. And so Vanessa, my sister's just like, oh, God, Bobo, when Dad dies, Mum's going to be a puddle of alcoholic, we'll lose her, and I'm going to be a mess because it's Dad, and you're going to have to do the urology. So clearly, if there was going to be a writer in the family, there was no choice. It was going to be me. And and my mother made sure during the Rhodesian War, there is a program on television right now about the British in Aden. It's really grim and gruesome, and people are forever getting blown up, and they're forever having affairs, and the whole lot of them drink like fish. And my mother watches this with much shock, and she goes, and the children are forever getting kidnapped and shot and what have you. And she goes, who would move to the front line of a war with small children and then drink like fish and carry on? I was like, I guess after 5 memoirs, we really all do have our blind spots. So is she reading this thing and going, this is not me? Although so she, we did live on the front line of the war. My parents, my father was reasonably innocent, I suppose. He came out to Kenya to see a giraffe because it was the days when you could sort of do that if you were British. The whole empire was still sort of stained in your memory, vaguely pink, most of it except for Germany. It was just a black blot somewhere in Europe. You didn't go there. And other than that, the whole globe felt like it was yours. And my mother had been raised in Kenya. And then they moved to Rhodesia very deliberately to avoid being in a majority-run African country. And so that really, in a way, like if anyone says, well, so what kind of parents do you have? I mean, you do want to say raising your child as white supremacist is baseline abusive. But what is, to put it mildly, but what is weird about that is, of course, you love your parents, you love your community. And we didn't use those words in Rhodesia. We didn't say we were white supremacists. We didn't have to, because if you are it, you don't have to say it. I mean, much like the US today, you just are it. And then that's how, you don't have to sort of announce yourself as white supremacist, because that sounds like the next thing you're going to do is be wearing a white sheet. And we weren't that. I mean, you can't really use your Uzi submachine gun very well if you're wearing a white sheet, and it doesn't camouflage perfectly. There we were on the front line. When I was 6 and my sister was 9, we were given an Uzi submachine gun in the very likely event that there was an attack on our farm. And we were given the target of a black man to shoot at. And we were shown the difference between shooting to kill and shooting to maim, and that what you were really aiming to do here was shooting to kill. And so you're 6 and 9, and this is a massive loss of innocence. I mean, that is an erosion of your childhood that is a labor to get back to. It's a labor to get back to the wisdom of childhood after you've had that kind of shattering. But part of it was the Rhodesians who, as I've now hopefully painted a portrait, were fairly hardcore-ish people. Even they thought that it was a bit much to send kindergartners over minefield-infested roads from these remote farms into the cities and towns to go to boarding school. So what they did for little kids, kindergarten kids, was they had your mother teach you at home, your correspondence school, which I'm sure really worked out well for some kids. But I had my mother, so she would get this packet from what was then now Harare, then Salisbury, and she'd rifle through it and she'd go, mathematics, throw that out. She goes, darling, you can always pay someone to count for you. Now, what are you going to write about? And then she would have a biography-worthy day, and I would write the stories, and they would say, we were asking for a non-fiction account of your week. And I'd be like, what was? And so I really didn't have a choice. I couldn't count. I could only write. And if you met my mother, bear in mind, she is I mean, she's mentally ill. She says everyone. I actually have a certificate to prove how mentally ill I am, and she, I mean, she drinks a serious amount. And the woman that is terrible with an Uzi submachine gun, she gets that thing going. All the trees, the leaves are gone. So you don't. I mean, you're just hoping. Like if she wasn't aiming for you, even this is a dangerous place to be. So of course I was a writer. I mean, I wasn't gonna not be a writer if that's what she wanted me to be. And I wrote 10 novels, and they were all wildly rejected. My agent fired me. And she said, maybe have a little bit of talent, but you don't have a story. And I thought, well, I mean, actually. And so I wrote Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, the first sort of book that got me out, mostly so that my children would know, because I assumed they wouldn't. This was nearly 20 years ago, that they would never know racism as I had known and experienced and acted on it. I mean, they would never know that, I assumed. They would never know a time like we now know in this country. They would never know a weekend like we had last weekend. And I also felt like, they weren't going to know my parents the way I knew them. They wouldn't know this country the way I knew them. So I really wrote, but I wrote it for them. So it was sort of a fairy tale version of my childhood. You don't want your kids to know everything. At any rate, my mother got a hold of this book, obviously. I mean, kind of unavoidably. And she was absolutely furious. She didn't talk to me for 4 years. But her response was, "You make me sound like a racist alcoholic." I said, "But and your objection to this?" And it turned out that what I was doing, and have done in every subsequent book, is that I have looked around on the bookshelf. I love books. I mean, it's one of the greatest gifts my mother gave me was when she heard that a family had been attacked, a white farming family had been attacked and had fled their farm overnight. My mum was the first person on the farm, not to make sure everyone was okay, but to raid their library and pick up their animals. So she would come back with a Land Rover packed with books and dogs, say, "Oh, the Hamilton Smiths had to leave, but they've got a fabulous collection." So we were always overrun with other people's dogs and their books. And we travel. I mean, that's what we took with us. That and the Le Creuset pots, they survived everything. I mean, she was such a sort of unbelievably resilient character. And all through this, she also lost 3 children, but almost didn't skip a beat. And that was astonishing to me as I grew up and had 3 children, one of whom is here tonight, my youngest. And so there really was this way in which, she was such a mixture. And I think that is what is such a confusing thing if you grow up in a racist family, as a lot of white settler Americans do, as a lot of white settlers in my part of the country do. You grow up with that racism, but in that racism is also the love that you have. This is your family. This is who you eat with. We all hear about this racist uncle everyone has at the Thanksgiving table. Where is he? I want to meet this guy because he's everyone's uncle. And I think that is, well, we just tolerate him. And Uncle blah, blah, after he's had a few not safe in taxis or corridors. So we have I think, a history of not talking about the people in our family who make us squirm and uncomfortable. And it turns out I am the one in the family who makes everyone squirm and uncomfortable because I refused to follow the dominant narrative. And part of that was looking on the shelves, my mother's extensive collection of books, any bookshelf, and seeing what other white settler writers from Kenya and Africa were writing about, and not seeing the neurosis of racism, not seeing how amputated the spirituality is of people who have decided to ignore the spirituality, dignity, and humanity of the 6 million people living around them, say at most 100,000 white people living in Rhodesia, and making sure the whole country runs for you. And so when people say, "Oh, Zimbabwe, what a tragedy, it's really collapsed since colonial days." Well, the country was structured to support 100,000 people, not 6 million people. That infrastructure was just for a tiny percentage of elites. It remains that way. Nothing's changed. It's just we're all so sort of I think terrified of talking about the transition from colonialism to to freedom and what that means and the hangover of all that violence. What is the half-life of all that violence, of all that sort of racism? And so I wrote Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight as my answer to, Out of Africa. And then I wrote every other book as my answer to, when I got to Wyoming, I wrote a book about a cowboy, it was a nonfiction book, because the cowboys that I was meeting and the myth of the cowboy were two entirely different people. I was discovering our cowboys in Wyoming very rarely move cattle. They might do it once in a while, but it's more of a hobby. They might get called if they have horses to move cattle once or twice a year, but mostly they're working on oil fields. Wyoming majority of its economy is oil and gas. But we say we're the cowboy state. We're so dishonest. And I'm always amazed that all my reviewers say, with piercing honesty, lacerating honesty. I'm like, well, so is everyone else just lying through? Yes, turns out they are. And that is, I think, a very white settler thing. We lie by omission. We lie by silence. We lie by collusion. We just straight out lie. We have a great example in this town. We lie and lie and lie, and we are terrified of truth because the truth is supposed to sting and hurt and make us change the course of the way we are. I mean, not always, hasn't worked in my family. When my father died a few years ago, 2015, and when I got the call to say, your father's very sick with pneumonia in Budapest. First of all, I was like, wait, Budapest? And also secondly, wait, pneumonia? I knew he would be dying because I'd had so many other calls previous to that saying, your dad's been shot, ran over, scalped, I don't know, hijacked. He's had malaria and bilharzia and every other thing. And I was like, well, he's going to, if you can, he's going to survive all of that. But pneumonia in Budapest, that's weird enough. This is going to kill him. And so I was on the next flight there. And I got to spend 12 days with my dad as he died. And it was such an education because he really believed in suffering well. And he really admired the way Southern Africans suffered. 500 years of practice, those poor bastards. They're really good at it. He didn't think the English knew how to suffer except the Queen. She can take it on the chin all right, but the rest of them, bunch of bloody wimps. Italians always cry for their mothers, he said. And he said, the Americans you can't tell because it's all just so loud. But he really had by then suffered like a Southern African. And so this book, as much as anything, started out because I could nowhere on the shelves find a book on grief that was also a celebration of what he didn't have a very long life, but he filled every inch of it as if he did. He was 75 when he died. But, what it means to erode yourself and that erosion is helped by suffering. I mean, I think that some people can get to an erosion of the essence of themselves without having to lose 3 children and every farm they ever try and farm on and sort of their sense of status and everything else that had come from him as he had sort of eroded from, a voluntarily white supremacist volunteering to fight for Ian Smith to someone who lived in a village of 60,000 Tonga and very rarely saw other white settlers. And if he did, sort of drove past them. He absolutely hated aid workers. Anyone here who's an NGO, my dad would just drive off the road trying to hit them on his car. They would be wobbling off on their bicycles. Bloody NGOs, why don't they go and dig latrines where they'd come from? And so he'd be yelling and my mother would be holding on. Tim, pretending she was hating every minute of it, just delighted. Vanessa and I saying our prayers in the back of the car. My father always felt like it took agency away, and he was all about self-agency. He also hated Bill Gates. He had no idea who he was, but he just thought Bill Gates had invented the computer, and his computer had died, or it was very difficult to start the damn thing. And it was about 16 years old, the computer, but it lived in its little box, its little styrofoam box. He brought it down to the pub once a week. Everyone knew all my dad's passwords because he couldn't remember them. So his bank and everything else. And then when it died, he had to take it to someone in Chirundu Market to fix it. Mr. Mwalabo managed to fix the computer. So he was like, Mr. Mwalabo versus Bill Gates. Yes, this is it. And then he heard Bill Gates wanted to do circumcision in Zambia and of all places, Swaziland, to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS. My father was horrified. Oh my God, Shoopy, he says to the barman at the bottom of the farm. Bill Gates is coming for our family jewels. Run for the hills, run for the hills. You wouldn't trust a man whose computer breaks after 16 years anywhere near your tackle, would you? So there was this, incredible irreverence, the way he sort of misanthropically misunderstood the world so that he understood it perfectly. And as he lay dying, it was he hadn't said anything to Mum. He had gone to Budapest because it turned out my father adored Paris. And somebody had told him that Budapest was the poor man's Paris. So as a surprise, he had a reasonable banana crop. There'd only been some disease. They went to Budapest. And Mum had been having so much fun going up the Danube and showing off her very good legs and all the blue pools they have. She likes to tell everyone, I've got fabulous legs for a riding boot. And so he didn't want to ruin her fun. But then apparently one night at supper, after about 3 nights there, he suddenly said, the waiter's a spy. And then Mum said, and he collapsed like a souffle. I had to ask the spy to call an ambulance. I said, wait, you mean the waiter? She said, oh, Bobo. Very difficult to have an emergency in a foreign language. So, in this sweltering heat, absolute heat wave, there are also the streets absolutely clogged with Syrian and Afghani refugees. I mean, the Budapest train stations closed down. The roads are shut down. It's a city under siege, and my dad is dying in a crumbling communist-era hospital that the elevator hadn't worked for years. The stairs were sort of grooved in, and the oncology patients drifted around the weedy grounds. There were about 100 stray cats, all smoking cigarettes with their little things. And Mum befriended the cats. She kept taking Dad's trays of food down for the cats. Well, he's dying. He doesn't need it. And feeding the cats, she's nothing if not pragmatic. And she kept saying, state of the art, this place, isn't it? And the staff, the doctors and everything were useless. They didn't care. They all went off water skiing. The doctor sunburned himself so badly, he had blisters. It's not surprising Dad died. When I got there, he had been strapped to the bed. He was restrained. He had handcuffy things on the bed. And the nurse explained to me in her terrible English, that he had tried to punch her. And I said, he's sort of a gentleman. That's surprising. Well, I was trying to give him an enema. I said, well, an Englishman's bottom is his castle. And to which she looked very surprised. Clearly he didn't look at all like an Englishman by the time he was on his deathbed. He was so sunburned, he was the color of wood. But we did take the restraints off after that. I said, as long as you don't go anywhere near, we're going to be all right. And so he managed to, and he was so strong. He had been farming 12 years before he died. He had been walking around the farm, always inspecting everything. And so it really was a lesson on how to die, how to march into death. Like once you know it's coming, not wait around and hope there's another treatment and put up with an enema and no, that's it. And somebody who had fought with him in the war said, yes, he was terrifying as a soldier. First of all, he was an awful shot. And secondly, he always lengthened his stride when other people would have found it more prudent to tiptoe. And so once he died, it was a hilarious thing. Only my parents could make death very funny. So my mother goes up to the doctor. She had Budapest, they smoked like chimneys. There had been this heat wave. So I'd shoved Mum in the bedroom, but she had stopped being able to breathe. She's asthmatic. And I thought it'd be just like me to go over to Budapest to help one parent die and accidentally kill the other. So I was like, right, you stay in the bedroom. So when Dad died, we had to break into the ICU. My mother goes, watch this, communist era doors. This is my forte. So she sort of smashes her way into the ICU. Because I had made the mistake of complaining about the treatment. And after that, visiting hours were changed and the doors were locked. And I had to get locked in there to be with my father. My mum said, you're such a pest and you're so bossy. I'm not surprised they tried to lock you out. But anyway, she was squeezing and massaging the doctor. Oh, thank you so much for everything you've done. She got a grip. I mean, this woman can ride terrifying horses. So, and this poor guy was, sweating and tears were spurting out of his eyes. Oh, no, it's not your fault. Don't worry. I mean, he should have died ages ago the way he lived. We're not at all upset, are we, Bobo? No, it's fine. It's fine. I don't, you shouldn't take this personally. Anyway, we left. I go, Mom, he's not sad Dad died. He's got about third-degree sunburn. She goes, oh, well, should have said something. I'm like, well, it didn't seem something you slip into conversation at that moment. So this is right after that. There is a difference I found between a hospital housing your sick and one in which you imagine vividly your dead is lying, tagged like you see in movies on a slab in the basement mortuary. Timothy Donald Fuller, born unremarkably March 9, 1940, Northampton, England. Died improbably September 4, 2015, Pest, Hungary. Until yesterday, I'd viewed this rambling, ugly hospital as a temporary holding station in which my father was serving out an inevitable sentence in a hot, strange, sad city with me as witness. But the fact of his dying had changed the shape of everything. Now the building was a monument to his death, Dad's final breaths taken here, his soul untangling from flesh within these walls. His determinedly good death, his noble suffering, had visited grandeur where previously there'd been only a kind of surrendered sadness, a rotation of bodies washing in and out of view. I had had too much of a colonial upbringing, and my father had been too English for Rupert Brooke not to tumble unbidden into my head. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. But neither my father nor I was so deluded to think an Englishman's blood was enough to stain the soil of any nation richer, or that dying somewhere as a soldier or a civilian or a refugee or a tourist made that land yours no matter how much you had suffered on it or for it. Nothing seemed that certain anymore. Such claims were fighting words, words to get lost by, and certainly not the reassurance I was seeking. Still, a few days ago, back when he had still been labouring toward death and shouting instructions in his morphine haze to Mr. Kalusha, the farm's driver, to hurry home before dark, I had given semi-serious thought to getting my father in the back of a rental van and making a break for it with him, driving east from Hungary, then south to Gibraltar. I'd have opened the van doors, propped my father up as close as I could to the straight. On a clear day, he might have seen Africa one last time. I'd have fed him brandy. He'd have died in Mum's arms. Or he'd have died in no one's arms. That's someone else's family. But at least Mum and I could have been fussing with the picnic basket, cursing the lid to the thermos, fighting off the troop of Barbary macaques in the vicinity. He might have died then, gazing south from Europe toward his beloved farm, a familiar, cheerful chaos in the background, Mum shrieking at some monkeys. That would have been a fathomable death for me, a more coherent inscription in my mind. Timothy Donald Fuller, born unremarkably March 9, 1940, England, died within sight of Africa, September 4, 2015. But it doesn't work like that, of course. Death comes when it comes, and when it comes, it doesn't wait around for any man, wife, parent, or daughter to announce his or her readiness for it. There is no planning for the perfect death, or rather there is, but there's no planning for the perfect aftershock of a loved one's death. The assault of it is always new, always each grief finding a new wormhole into our hearts. Like all life's shocks, beginning with our own unasked for births, there's no guarding against the shock of sorrow, the shock of losing parts of the self. And death, like birth, afterward everything's a first, a long pile-up of firsts. The first decision I'd be making on Dad's departed behalf, the first true uncertainty about who I'd become with his death, because until now, whatever else I'd been, I'd always also been Tim Fuller's daughter. And that had really meant something one or two places. The Chirundu market, for example, where Dad did all his farm shopping. He'd be sorely missed there. Also the little safari lodge on the Kafui River, they'd notice he was gone. Of course, Boss Shoopy, who knew all his passwords at the pub. would look for him in vain every morning at 11 for the remainder of the dry season. And they'd never forget my father at Huey's Pub and Grill in Lusaka, where in recent memory Dad had set his trousers on fire, dancing on the table over wilting paraffin candles. "I was led astray by a Malawian waiter," my father explained in his defense. "3 Irish whiskies after a fulsome dinner. Of course I got a bit overexcited." What I wasn't anticipating when I lost my father, which was an easy grief, and I think this is true in a lot of families, was that I would lose a lot with him, that my relationship with my mother would become fractured to the point of irreparable, and with my sister, and that then I would lose the farm, and that everything that I had identified, this grief upon grief, and I, in a tiny, weeny way, began to feel what it must be like to be a refugee, to lose, land and family, and what it really is. I mean, in minuscule and sort of a homeopathic droplet of it. And then not quite 3 years after my father died, my son died suddenly in his sleep, 21 years old, and just an absolute shock. I mean, there was no sort of real warning that this was going to happen. And I had just written that part of the book. And so I now had the rest of the book to write with the knowledge that there are griefs and griefs. And that grief is the gift that we're given. That suffering is the gift we're given to erode our egos, because any amount of physical attachment, any amount of, sort of material holding on was too unbearable for me. The only way to survive this was to dissolve myself in the vat of grief that is so painful, and to get down to the essence of who I was, which is, of course, what my father had done. And I think that, when your father dies, you lose your history, and that's okay. But when your son dies, you lose your future, and you're left just in the agonizing present, in the incredibly painful now, in which every moment is a moment in which you have to reckon with who you are. And that is all you are. And that goes on and on. I mean, that is what grief is. And as I became more and more acquainted with, the cycles of grief, which are, as we all know, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance, what I realized is that most of the people around me seem to be stuck in one of those phases of grief. I mean, everyone I know seems to be in some denial. We're very angry as a nation. We're bargaining as hell. I mean, we're bargaining our future away. We have all the evidence necessary to tell us that we can't keep living as we are, or we won't have a planet for our children to inherit, let alone for us to stand on. And depression, I mean, opioid epidemic, that would seem that we might be a bit depressed. And finally, that if you arrive at acceptance, the amazing part of that, if you can accept your son's death, what is it that you can't accept? Would be my question. And the solace that I received wasn't from my family. They didn't communicate with me after my son died. My mother sent a message through the farm secretary about a week after my son died with her sincere condolences. I mean, that kind of coldness. "I hate grief," she said. "I don't want to go through it. I didn't do it myself," which may explain the amount she drinks and her madness. I can see that. Because before now, this was always a mystery. And it was always the excuse that my parents had, that, okay, they lost 3 children, and that for that to have happened, you can pretty much behave however you want. I've lost 1. That's not true. No amount of loss gives you the right to behave however you want. I mean, I cannot imagine what refugees go through. I can't imagine that amount of grief. And yet still, you have a kind of divine contract to become the essence of yourself, not just become, the totalness of your losses. And what really saved me after my son died, I mean, after my father died, there's sort of a collective shrug. So what, the guys, whatever, your father, you're next in line. But in white settler culture anyway, there is no instruction about how to do this. Even in our religious structure, I'm Episcopalian because I have a complicated relationship with the God in this country that we have decided to weaponize. I find that, the God in this country has become a weapon of destruction, not a divine presence. But I'm Episcopalian because they're polite enough to barely mention God and sometimes say one or two things about Jesus. And we're a tiny, I live in Wyoming, there's a tiny Jewish community and they share our chapel for their services. And so they throw a sheet over Jesus when they've got there. So sometimes you go into our chapel and there's Jesus, and that's, I think Jesus would be fine with that. But we don't have a sort of spiritual tradition to get us through this. And my friend, who's also a writer, Irison Wanza, who's here, reminded me, and she sent me a piece of writing in which she mentioned the tradition of Mzimu, which is where when somebody dies, the rest of your community howl and scream and ululate and throw themselves on the ground and roll around because, as Iris so beautifully explained in her book, it is understood that to separate the bonds of love between people who are that connected, it's too painful and difficult for one person to do. Your community supposed to do it with you. But in white settler community, people look at you and say, oh my God, I can't even imagine. I don't know how you get through this. And then they flee. And it is on top of the hardest thing you've ever done. Therefore, also the loneliest. And it was the people from home and the thank God, that I had spent some time on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation talking to Lakota and seeing how many similarities there are between, say, the Mashona, Chewa, and Lakota traditions that in indigenous culture, and I'm not an expert on indigenous cultures everywhere, but it seems to me that there is this lively communication with the dead. Your dead aren't dead, they're your ancestors. And so when your father becomes your ancestor, it seems to me an invitation for you to become an elder. When your child becomes an ancestor, it is an invitation to become more than an elder. It's an invitation to return to the wisdom of childhood without prejudice, with wonder and astonishment, and to have joy and acceptance. And the most sustaining and beautiful message that I got after my son died was from a school friend of Iris and mine, actually from Zimbabwe, who wrote, "We're devastated with you." Not, you're on your own here. "We're devastated with you. The first one is the hardest." Reminding me that where we come from, it's common to lose more than one child. And that erosion of self, when people say, I went to safari in Zimbabwe, they have nothing, but they're so cheerful and resilient. They didn't wake up like that. People don't wake up like that. It is work to be cheerful and resilient. And that's where it comes from, being bathed in this vat of suffering and coming out with I have an enormous ego, so I've had to go through more rounds of grief than probably anyone else to get here. But you have to have a huge ego to write 5 memoirs, let's face it. I put the me into memoir, and my 13-year-old daughter said, "No, you didn't, Mum. You put the moi into it." I'm going to end it there so we have 5 minutes for questions. Thank you. I'm so sorry I went over and left so little time for all of you. Hi.
I'm a great admirer of your, is it on? Of your works, but I always wondered.
Was it on? Because he said he was a great admirer of my works.
When your family decided to leave Kenya and move to Rhodesia, did it cross your mother and father's mind that what happened in Kenya was going to happen in the other countries, and they were just like a step ahead, and that it was inevitable? And my second question is totally different.
Oh God, I'm never going to remember 2.
Okay.
Can I answer that one?
Yes, please.
Because that brings me back to this issue of white settler denial. It is unprocessed stages of grief. And I think what happens listen, I have now decided that if it is good for indigenous communities and women, it's probably not part of dominant white settler culture. And grief is good for women. It is practiced rigorously and sort of condemned. I mean, can you imagine if we had a funeral and flung ourselves on the ground? And I mean, we would be better people, I can tell you that. But it would be so frowned upon at a WASP funeral. I mean, my mother would never get over it.
Second question is, I don't know whether you still live in a yurt.
Yes.
But can you tell us about why you decided to live there in Wyoming and what it's like?
Well, so after my son died, I have a sheep wagon and a yurt. Actually, I'm quite posh, and the thing that absolutely stayed with me, and it's in the book. My father died close to a full blood moon, and after he died, Mum said, it was a very good death, and he died under a blood moon, and that's very auspicious. And then she gave me the whole lecture she always has on new moons, and you should turn money over in your pocket because it'll make you rich. I mean, it has not worked for her, but I'll pass that on in case it does. I think capitalism in general doesn't say anything about the new moon. But there is, and this is true of, say, if you're out on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, the Lakota, greeting the morning star every morning, you are not separate, literally not separate from your environment. Like the universe hangs over you as like a cradle. You're in it, you're of it. There is no separation. That has been the biggest fallacy. And it's why we're at each other's throats. We have this idea that we're all supposed to be making it alone. It's absolute rubbish. You can't make it alone. And it's a fallacy that you did. You didn't make it here alone. Trust me, you didn't. And so but there is an incredible longing and loneliness that comes with the loss of a child. So I dragged my sheep wagon up into the Wind River Mountains and slept there. Because at least if I couldn't sleep, and you can't in that kind of grief, the moon was my constant companion. She traveling over me every night, the stars, the fact that I was near running water, that I needed to build a fire in the stove every night of my little sheep wagon or I'd freeze to death, that every time I stepped out of the sheep wagon, I stood on earth. And so I was in the elements. I was in rain and earth, ground and fire and water all the time. And since that's what I'm made of and Fia's made of, Fuller is made of, and my father and Hitler and everybody else, every dog and cat and fiber and being, you couldn't be less alone. It's a cacophony of ancestors and possibility out there. And as one goes through, as I went through these stages and stages of grief, because you don't just go through one cycle, not for your father, not for your son. I'll be doing this till I die. What you find at the essence of yourself, where there is no pain, where there is relief, what you find there is God. And it turns out you and God and the universe and my son and your sons and daughters and Hitler, it's all in there. It's all in there. It's all in there. There was nothing to hate in the first place. There was only something to love. And that profound sense of being unlonely is why I live in a sheep wagon or a yurt. And actually the clue that I got, even before I moved into a yurt, was I was talking to a Lakota elder who said, when you live in four walls with a square thing above you, there's no room for the soul and the spirit to sort of spiral and for the wind to shake you awake. There is this way that you've chopped yourself off from the world. So to live in a yurt is to live befriended always, always. And, there's going to be a time when, I'm going to be very old living in a yurt. And that will be good for me too, because I'll be having to carry my own wood up there. And, it stops me from separating myself too much from a world which is already riven with separation. And it stops me getting above myself. You really can't. If you live in a yurt, there's no getting, like every day is a humiliation. More questions. Well, I would love to write a novel. I've thought of the title, Ignorance is Bliss, Wyoming, about a town called Ignorance is Bliss. Very difficult to be born in ignorance, but you can easily die there, is my opening line. Because, when I was up in the mountains grieving, I looked like, of course I'd lost my mind. I'm running around in a kukoi, if anyone knows what that is, like a East African sarong and a sweat. I just didn't care. I grabbed what I could out of my, listen, I tell you, you do not care what you look like when your son's died. And I dragged my sheep wagon up into the mountains, and it's hunting season. And most of the hunters in Wyoming, I would venture to say, do not share my politics. And so there I am with them. They're absolutely loaded to the teeth. I don't care. And I'm in a sheep wagon. They're all there, and they're like hardcore camo tents and what have you. And I'm wandering around, like crying my eyes out, just drifting around in the woods, and then, locking myself in my sheep wagon and meditating. And, anyway, eventually one of them comes up to me and he goes, "Ma'am, I'm a hunter." I was like, "Yeah, I gathered that." Guy's just dripping with guns. And he goes, "And I don't want to shoot you if I can help it. So I hunt at dawn and dusk. So if you could keep your activities to the middle of the day, we can share this mountain." And then he looks around, he notices my stove isn't properly secured in the sheep wagon, which I've been, driving all around with. And it turns out he had the tools right there with him. He was like MacGyver. He's, "Oh, I've got to fix this for you." And so the next thing is he fixes my stove. And I was so impressed. I go, "What's your name? I thank you so much." And he goes, "My name's Sean." I'm like, you're amazing. And he goes, "Well, no, but if you're ugly, you better be useful." And then he asked what the hell I was doing up in the mountains in the middle of hunting season. And I said, "I lost my son a month ago." And the next thing is, about once a day, I would get a piece of elk meat delivered to me. From different hunters. It got round. Like, I ate so much elk. I walked out there actually reincarnated as elk. And it was so loving. And so in this loving space, we began to talk about death and responsibility and community. And I realized how close we were. Politically, like this. But in reality, when it came right down to it, and we're now talking about, the nitty-gritty stuff. We were right there. And so I would love to write a book that was my love of the people of Wyoming, that doesn't just make them, whatever the word is, despicable or something, which I hate. That's immediately so othering. It ends the conversation. They're deplorables. I'm so sorry. And I think that immediately there's no conversation to be had. And trust me, if you asked Sean, who fixed my stove, what he thought of the liberal elites in Jackson, it's probably, if he had the word deplorable, he would use it, but he used a much more catchy and colorful phrase. And that's where we are. Where are we ever going to get like that? Let's have a conversation and it doesn't matter that my politics are this. It matters more that I have a sense of humor and compassion.
Hi. I kind of came in on the end of the talk, but I just wondered if you resonate for me with Kathleen Norris in Spiritual Geography.
Yes, I loved that book. It's one of my favorite. It's on my Are You Her? No, it's on my bookshelf. I would have run up and kissed you. Dakota is a really powerful book. I love it. And I love the fact that Kathleen Norris wrote a book called Dakota that you should read. That's a really beautiful book about finding spirituality and these sort of flyover states.
I have relatives in Gregory, South Dakota. I've been to the Dakota Reservation. It's all amazing. You also sound like Thomas Merton, who says the holiest people around are the Native Americans. And your experience sounds so much to me like what I discovered in my own grief when I lost a dear, dear friend a few years ago, a brother. And it's called Kaddish, and it's a Jewish man finding Leon, Wieseltier wrote his experience of grief, and he discovered within his own faith tradition, which he totally ignored, the Jewish faith tradition, he discovered Kaddish. And I adopted his Kaddish for 1 year, and it's a prayer ritual that is done in community. You're familiar with this? it just blends so beautifully with the work that you do, or what you're saying, and I consider it a work of kindness. I adopted all of that, and it's a prayer ritual 3 times a day, morning, lunch, and dinner, remembering, crying, and grieving through the whole thing. Are you familiar with this at all?
I'm not, but it's pretty much what I did.
There you are.
Yeah.
It's deep in, I believe, and a friend put me onto this. I think it's deep in our DNA to do
Yeah,
that.
we're born to grieve, and we're born to survive grief.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Your stories are very cinematic. Has anyone ever approached you to make a movie?
Yes.
Of any of them?
Yes.
Oh.
Much to my mother's horror.
Do you think you'll do it?
You know what? I have had so many. Hollywood's very fickle. So you have people and they're thrilled with your book, and then nothing comes of it. So that it just sort of is this froth that's there. But I get on with my life in my yurt,
Yeah.
chop wood, carry water, and if they make a movie, fine. If they don't, oh well. And they'll get
I
it
hope
so
it
wrong.
happens.
I always find, I mean, the reviews get it so wrong. I'm like, are we reading did you read the book I wrote? And then you realize they didn't get it wrong, and I'm calling the person wrong. That's what they got from the book. They're right.
Right.
I just didn't see it
Yeah.
that way. Yeah.
Well, I hope you do get to make a movie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I have time for one more question, or are you okay? Yes. There we go.
What has happened with your family's farm in Zimbabwe?
Well, they're farming in Zambia.
Oh, they're Zambia now? Okay.
So they're still on it. And the farm in Zimbabwe I went back to a few years ago, and it's great. There's about 12 or 14 families living on it, and managing to make a way better go of it than we ever did. It was such a terrible farm. I mean, it was so brave to even try. And so it was a really healing visit to go back there and see that, no, this land has been used by the people, whose families are from there for generations and generations before our brief, really disastrous attempt to try and sort it out and put tobacco in it. They're growing food crops and a little bit of tobacco. And it was I have a very different relationship with nostalgia than my mother does. Yeah. She has a disease of nostalgia. Me, I'm glad Rhodesia's over. She goes, you don't remember socialism the way I do. I'm the one who had to come up with the marvelous meals. You and your father could just sit around saying how wonderful it was that we were all so poor together. Thank you.